A lot of us are talking about talent and how to get the right talent. So I want to talk a little bit about how do we, the talent proving ground for new CEOs. A World Economic Forum researcher and writer published in Forbes Insight recently an article that really caught my attention. And it was really about how supply chain professionals, so chief supply chain officers, VPs of supply chain, how they're perfectly positioned to become the CEOs, many of the CEOs of the future, particularly in manufacturing sectors, healthcare, distribution, logistics, transportation, maybe even retail. And the reason for that was actually three reasons, it turns out. The first thing is that so many companies that succeed and fail, or well, let's just talk about succeed, they have a decent or a good strategy, they still have to execute every single day. And the pandemic taught us about agility and resiliency like no other period in our history, in our industrial history. And so we look to the supply chain professionals to keep, as we say metaphorically, keep the trains running. And so with the enormous problems built into the supply chain from the pandemic that turned into shortages and turned into bottlenecks in ports and turned into what we call bullwhip effects of demand and supply and logistics and transportation, the chief supply chain officers of the largest companies and even medium and smaller companies kept their businesses alive. And so it turns out the first real reason for the training ground of supply chain leadership being able to move into the CEO suite or CEO position is that they really understand how to really manage the business's risks. They really understand, it turns out, how to balance supplies and demands. They really understand how to operate under pressure. And as one other author said, they understand how always to have a plan B and a plan C in their pockets. In other words, supply chain, especially during the pandemic, taught us about the people who really know how to make things happen and take a good strategy and actually make it happen, even in a bad situation. The second reason is, and I've personally witnessed this, is that if you really take a look at the digitalization of business, the digital strategies and digital directions of businesses, the supply chain organizations and all the entities within supply chain generally are leading that technology. One could argue that you have the digitalization in the financial world, so the fintech probably is equal to that. But outside of financiers, manufacturing, distribution, logistics is largely leading the way. And they have been actually for a couple decades. Most people don't really realize that. The whole enterprise resource planning world and all the breakouts of that have pretty much demonstrated that there's an enormous focus on efficiency, utilization, and productivity of hard assets and people assets in the supply chain world. Now, let's remember what supply chain is. Take a typical manufacturing company. It's how to manage suppliers and how to manage sometimes the suppliers. It's how to manage the inbound logistics. It's how to manage the conversion of material from raw material to work process to finished goods, how to manage the outbound distribution, probably through a channel intermediary like distribution centers, how to get it to the customer of the manufacturing facility, and then how to get it to the consumer through maybe other channel intermediaries like retail. And then, of course, today, because of companies like Amazon, a huge amount of focus on reverse logistics as well, getting return material back so you at least the most cost-effective way possible. And so it turns out this digital business, the digital marketplace, has dramatically improved because of the innovation, the creativity, and of course, the curiosity of supply chain professionals. The third is that supply chain, because it's so global, any supply chain leader has to have a diverse view of the world. You know, I was talking to a gentleman in supply chain at the reasonably high level at Amazon, and he says, I surround myself with leaders and people who represent the marketplace that I distribute into, because they give me their cultural perspectives, they give me their global perspectives, they give me their economic perspectives. And so supply chain has naturally grown up, look like that. I can take you into any large supply chain organization, and it looks like the United Nations in terms of people. And so to a large extent, supply chain, the end supply chain as we call it, have been leading the way to do that. I think that's good for companies, because I think ultimately a leader, a CEO who comes with a supply chain background can do a really good job. Take a look at the prior CEO, quite a number of CEOs, but I was thinking of Danaher. The leader of Danaher came up from being a materials manager and was a spectacular organization. I mean, we look at economic analytics on a cash flow return on investment basis, and there was 15 years where Danaher actually on a CFROI basis outperformed even GE back in the 70s, 80s, and even early 90s. And so The supply chain people, because they have this constant set of demands and constant set of supply risks that they have to balance. Turns out that looks like one of the really great skill sets to become a CEO in the future.